Governor's office inside the State House in Trenton. This is a last-minute addition to his schedule, according to the Associated Press. 1 p.m. Look for our coverage on C-SPAN 2. If you're not near a television then, tune in to cspan.org. Thanks for watching today.
Limited to 1 hour, and each member other than the majority and minority leaders and the minority whip limited to 5 minutes each. But in no event shall debate continue beyond 11:50 a.m. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I note with sorrow the passing of Roger Kennedy last Friday. Roger had a long and storied career that exemplified notions of public service. He was indeed a Renaissance man. It's hard to think of anything that Roger had not done in his lifetime, with the possible exception of hold elective office. He was director of the National Park Service, director of the Smithsonian's Natural Museum of American History, vice president of finance for the Ford Foundation. He was special assistant to 3 cabinet secretaries, a lawyer, a journalist, and somehow found time to write 10 books. Actually, he had run unsuccessfully for Congress against fellow Minnesotan Gene McCarthy over 60 years ago. How might history have been different if he had won? You found out about Roger's exploits in bits and pieces. When you were engaged in conversation, he would reach back into the past to illustrate points with very tangible, concrete, easy-to-understand examples, often with himself having been in the middle of it. My legislative director, Janine Benner, and I became acquainted with Roger as we were dealing with policies to prevent, cope, and recover from natural disasters. One of Roger's books was titled Wildfire and Americans: How to Save Lives, Property, and Your Tax Dollars. His kind words mentioning us by name in the acknowledgement was a high point of both of our careers. He was a valued participant in sessions we would have before and after Hurricane Katrina. He was a keen student of the built environment, dealing with unintended consequences of policy, whether putting Los Alamos nuclear laboratory facilities in the middle of an area that had been repeatedly burned by wildfires, or digging into the history of the early South, slavery and land use, the Jeffersonian model. He provided information and insights that were unique, profound, and provocative. Even after his retirement, he continued to be a scholar, an advocate, a friend, and a mentor, especially a mentor. I've read the articles that were about Roger in the New York Times, the Washington Post, but none captured better than a note from our legislative director, Janine Benner, who wrote, "Roger was a big thinker, understanding the way things in the world fit together. I loved just listening to him. It made me feel that at least there were a few people who understand how the world really should be. I always kept my notes from the conversations in hopes that they would make me smarter." He was devoted to public service even in retirement. He was always thinking about ways to make the world a better place. He was very focused on the past, writing books about history, but he was a master at using that knowledge to inform himself and others about the future. Preventing devastating damage from wildfires with his exploration of the flame zone was a great example. Mr. Speaker, we often talk about someone's passing as an opportunity to celebrate their life. It's hard to imagine a better life to be celebrated, more productive, with greater joy and insight than the life Roger Kennedy lived. Today, people in government seem incapable of dealing with big issues, matters of consequence, in a thoughtful and cooperative fashion. Well, there's no better role model for any of us to meet the challenge in all our opportunities and responsibilities than Roger Kennedy. On behalf of our legislative director, Janine Benner, the people in our office who are privileged to know and work with Roger, we extend our sympathies to his wife, Frances, and Roger's circle of families and friends. We are all going forward strengthened by Roger's friendship, scholarship, and example.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Jones, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. This Friday will be the 10th anniversary of our troops being committed to Afghanistan. This commitment by the previous administration and Congress was justified because bin Laden and al-Qaeda were responsible for 9/11. But now bin Laden is dead. Al-Qaeda is dispersed all around the world. Beside me is a poster of an honor guard carrying the flag-draped coffin off a plane at Dover Air Force Base. To accompany the photo, I will read into the record an editorial from Bob Schieffer titled "The Real Cost of War." I was in an airport lounge the other day when I saw a woman across the way. Why I kept staring, I don't know. Maybe it's just that she seemed so sad. And then I understood and I looked away, hoping she had not seen me stare. Because in her lap was an American flag, neatly folded into a triangle and placed in a clear plastic case. A flag folded the way it always is when it is given to a soldier's family, as the soldier's coffin is being lowered into the grave. I figured her to be a soldier's mother, and I couldn't help but wonder what memories that flag evoked as she held it there. Did it remind her her first time that she had seen her child in the delivery room? Or was it the memory of seeing him go off to school that first day? Or when he brought home the prize from the science fair? Or maybe made the touchdown or gave her the first Valentine when he wrote out, "Mommy, I love you." I kept thinking about all the talk in Washington about the high cost of defense and how we have to cut the Pentagon budget before it bankrupts this country. But as I watched that woman, budget seemed to be such a small part of all of it. No, the real cost of war is not what we pay in dollars and cents. The real cost is what we take from a mother who is left with just a memory and a neatly folded flag in a clear plastic case. This was over a year ago, and I want to thank Bob Schieffer. I don't think it can be said better than what he said that day, and I just read into the record. Why this Congress continues to complain about budgets and cuts and deficits and debts, and our young men and women are walking the roads of Afghanistan getting their legs blown off and getting killed. And we sit here in Congress and don't bring it up as an issue. And I want to thank my friends on both sides of the aisle and the Republicans on this side of the aisle who are trying to say to Mr. Obama, no, don't leave him there until 2014. Karzai is a crook. He is a corrupt leader. And you're spending $10 billion a month in Afghanistan, and you can't even audit the books in Afghanistan, and kids are dying. And yet right here in America, we're cutting programs for children to get a pint of milk in schools. And we're saying to a senior citizen, no sandwich at the Senior Citizen Center because we can't afford it. But Mr. Karzai, we're sending you $10 billion. And Mr. Speaker, it's borrowed money. It's not even Uncle Sam's money. It's probably Uncle Chang's money. But more important than the money is what Bob Schieffer said. It's the pain of war. And this Congress needs to come together and say to Mr. Obama, let's bring him home this year, next year, but not wait until 2014, 2015. And Mr. Speaker, I close as I always do on the floor of the House. Please, God, bless our men and women in uniform. Please, God, bless the families of our men and women in uniform. Please, God, in your loving arms, hold the families who've given a child dying for freedom in Afghanistan and Iraq. And ask God to bless the House and the Senate that we will do what is right in the eyes of God for his people. And ask God to give wisdom, strength, and courage to President Obama that he will do what is right in the eyes of God's people. And I'll say 3 times, God, please, God, please, God, please continue to bless America. I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I was in Colombia at the end of August with a delegation organized by the Washington Office on Latin America. In Medellin, we met with the National Labor School, or ENS, to discuss the current labor situation in Colombia. Their reports on threatened and murdered unionists are internationally recognized, and because of this, ENS faces constant threats and efforts to discredit them. While not at the levels of the early 2000s, violence against Colombia's workers continues. It is persistent and frequent. It is a reality that cannot be denied, and it is meant to silence people. At least 40 trade unionists have been murdered since President Santos took office last year. One benchmark in the Colombia Labor Action Plan is for the Attorney General's office to meet with ENS and determine how to address the more than 2,900 cases of murdered unionists, of which 90% remain in impunity. The first meeting happened in May, but there's been no second meeting. In Bogota, I met with Deputy Attorney General Juan Carlos Ferrero. I asked him when the next meeting would happen, and he said imminently. 5 weeks later, still no meeting. Last week, Human Rights Watch sent a study to Colombian Attorney General Vivian Morales. It says virtually no progress has been made in getting convictions for killings of labor activists that have occurred in just the past 4.5 years. So, virtually no progress on recent murders of labor activists and little progress on past cases. Mr. Speaker, I met with port workers, campesinos, workers on palm oil plantations, and petroleum and factory workers. Their reality is filled with risk, threats, and even death. They are not valued as human beings, Colombian citizens, or productive members of society. In Cartagena, port workers went on strike in March. Their working conditions are inhumane, and they are forced to work under various subcontracting schemes. These contracts deny them basic benefits and keep them in constant uncertainty about whether they will be working next week or even the next day. They just want the right to negotiate their contracts directly with their employers, the port associations. The port workers ended their strike after just a few days because the Santos government promised to facilitate talks between the workers and the port associations. But nothing happened, nothing changed. In fact, some things are worse. As part of the LAP, the most common subcontracting scheme, the so-called cooperatives, was abolished, except nothing was done to facilitate direct contracting between workers and their employers. So a new scheme has popped up called Simplified Joint Stock Companies, or SAS. Goodbye cooperatives, hello sauce, meet the new boss, worse than the old boss. The government has done little to help, unfortunately. When I asked Vice President Garzon about the port workers, he promised to meet again with their union leader. Mr. Speaker, it's not the workers he needs to meet with and convince to negotiate. It's the presidents of the port associations. Oil workers from Meta showed me photographs and documents describing poor living conditions and working conditions, unfair contracts, and how the Canadian-Venezuelan oil company, Pacific Rubiales, acts like a sovereign government on Colombian soil, destroying public roads, firing workers for organizing, and calling in security forces to tear gas striking workers. I'm sure it's not the whole picture, but once again, striking workers returned to work because the government promised to open talks with the company. Again, all the workers are asking for is the right to negotiate directly with the company about their contracts and their living and working conditions. And once again, the Colombian government let the workers down. In September, the strike was renewed, more explosive on all sides than the last one, because nothing had changed since July. Bruno Moro, the UN delegate in Colombia, called on everyone to come to the table and resolve this crisis, describing the conflict as a result of no one creating conditions for dialogue. The workers have again returned to work because of agreements by the government to open talks with the company. This time, I hope the government keeps its word. Mr. Speaker, nothing I saw in Colombia indicated things have changed for the better on the ground for Colombia's workers. Before we take up the FTA, we must demand concrete improvements in labor rights and security for Colombia's workers. Whatever we're doing now isn't working. It isn't making a difference, and it simply isn't enough. I yield back the balance of my time.
The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Wolf, for 5 minutes.
1 minute, revise and extend.
Without objection.
My conscience has compelled me to come to the floor today to voice concerns I have with the influence Grover Norquist, the President of the American for Tax Reform, has on the political process in Washington. My issue is not with ATR's goal of keeping taxes low. Like Ronald Reagan said, and I believe, the problem is not that the people are taxed too little. The problem is the government spends too much. I want to be perfectly clear. I do not support raising taxes on the American people. My concern is with the other individuals and groups and causes with whom Mr. Norquist is associated that have nothing to do with keeping taxes low. Among them, one are Mr. Norquist's relationship with Jack Abramoff. Mr. Abramoff essentially laundered money through ATR, and Mr. Norquist knew it. 2, his association and representation of terrorist financier and vocal Hamas supporter Abdurrahman al-Amoudi. He also associated with terrorist financier Sami al-Arian, who pled guilty in 2006 to conspiring to provide services to Palestinian Islamic Jihad. 3, Mr. Lorquist lobbying on behalf of Fannie Mae. 4th, Mr. Norquist's representation of the Internet gambling industry. 5th, Mr. Norquist's advocacy of moving Guantanamo Bay detainees to the United States, including 9/11 mastermind Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Simply put, I believe Mr. Norquist is connected with or has profited from a number of unsavory people and groups out of the mainstream. I also believe that Mr. Norquist has used the ATR pledge as leverage to advance many other issues that many Americans would find inappropriate and, when taken as a whole, should give people pause. I raise these concerns today in the context of dealing with the future of our country. America is in trouble. Unemployment is over 9%. Housing values continue to decline. Retirement accounts are threatened. The American people are worried, yet Washington is tragically shackled in ideological gridlock. Some are dead set against any change to entitlement programs, while others insist that any discussion of tax policy is off the table. We are at a point today that the tsunami of debt in America demands that every piece of the budget be scrutinized, and that means more than just cutting waste, fraud, and abuse and discretionary programs. The real runaway spending is occurring in our out-of-control entitlement cost and the hundreds of billions in annual tax earmarks in our tax code. Until we reach an agreement that addresses those two drivers of our deficit and debts, we cannot right our fiscal ship of state. Everything must be on the table, and I believe how the pledge is interpreted and enforced by Mr. Norquist is a roadblock to realistically reforming our tax code. When Senator Tom Coburn recently called for eliminating the special interest ethanol tax subsidies, who led the opposition? Mr. Norquist. Have we already forgotten the battle over earmarks from last year? Unlike an earmark included in an annual appropriation bill, tax earmarks are far worse because once enacted, they typically exist in perpetuity. Have we really reached a point where one person's demand for ideological purity is paralyzing Congress to the point that even a discussion of tax reform is viewed as breaking a no-tax pledge? I understand that some may not agree with what I say. I know many are not aware of Mr. Norquist's association, but my conscience compels me to speak out today. Reasonable people can differ on the merits of pledges, and I respect those differences. But on the issue is with the interpreter and the enforcer of the pledge. William Wilberforce, the British parliamentarian abolitionist, famously told his colleagues, he said, quote, "Having heard of all of this, you may choose to look the other way, but you can never again say you did not know." I urge my colleagues to read my full statement in the record, which will also be posted on my webpage, going into greater detail on the issues I have raised. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The Chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Woolsey, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, this week marks an anniversary we must acknowledge, but we certainly can't celebrate. This Friday, we will have spent 10 years at war in Afghanistan. We'll have spent a decade fighting a war that the American people no longer support. This sobering 10th anniversary is the time for reflection. Reflection on how our world has changed in the last 10 years. This war has consumed an unjustifiable amount of our financial treasure, led to an unprecedented burden on our service members, and changed forever how an entire generation of young people views the world. This anniversary is the time to reflect on the choices we made and their impact on the world. 10 years later, we are still building war machines that have the potential to cause devastating harm to innocent people around the world. 10 years later, many of our nation's best and brightest are coming home with scars, both physical and mental, that they and their families will live with forevermore. The numbers are against us. After a decade of war, we still have 90,000 soldiers fighting in Afghanistan. More than 1,800 Americans have died. Our nation has spent $460 billion on an unwinnable war, and tens of thousands of innocent Afghans and Iraqis have been killed. It is well past the time for us to end this. In remembering the last 10 years, we must think of the future. My 5 grandchildren are now part of a generation that has grown up without knowing what it's like to live in a country at peace. Over the past 10 years, we've led our world down a path towards war rather than fighting for peace, rather than fighting for a smarter security plan. The American people and the global community see the error in our policy, and we are facing increasing scrutiny from our international partners. In fact, not one other government agrees with the U.S. use of drones. In fact, our European allies have never supported the U.S. drone strikes in Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia. Instead of heeding their calls, we're expanding the use of this deadly force, creating automatic drones that have the potential to cause unchecked devastation. I've spoken from this spot, as you all know, because you've heard me so many times, 407 times in support of smart security, an approach for an end to the war. And I'm not alone. I've been joined by colleagues on both sides of the aisle and supported by Americans across the country to call for an end of our war and the return of our troops. That's exactly what my smart security plan is about, making military force a last resort, and instead directing our energy and our resources toward diplomacy, democracy, development aid, and the more powerful, peaceful ways of engaging with the rest of the world. Mr. Speaker, I hope all of my colleagues will take note of Friday's anniversary and realize that now is the time to turn the tide on our policies in Afghanistan. We need to end this war. We need to do it now. We need to promote peace through democracy. We need to promote peace through diplomacy and development. We must bring our troops home. I yield the remainder of my time.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Pompeo, for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since coming to Congress 9 months ago, I sadly relearned that the federal government in Washington, D.C. only grows and grows and grows. When Democrats, and many Republicans too, come to the floor of the House and talk about spending cuts, they're often talking simply about slowing the rate of growth of government. There is seldom, if ever, any real discussion about cutting the size of federal government or eliminating an entire program or agency. But today we've got $14.8 trillion in debt, and we can't continue to have any rate of growth. We've got to cut it. We've got to get rid of some things. As a first step this week, I proffer a bill that will eliminate the Economic Development Agency. It's part of the Department of Commerce. It was established in 1965 as an element of President Johnson's Great Society. For over 45 years, the EDA has spent billions on local projects, not national projects, trying to pick amongst various projects and winners and losers by region, industry, and community. Much like a stimulus bill or earmarks, the EDA provides loans and grants to pet projects of the administration in power. In 2008, the EDA spent $2 million on the Harry Reid Research and Technology Park at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And just last year, it spent $25 million on the Global Climate Mitigation Incentive Fund. This year, the agency will spend almost $300 million of taxpayer dollars. Now, this might not sound like a lot of money sometimes here in Washington, D.C., but in Newton and Independence and Wichita and Goddard, Kansas, that's still a lot of money. I want to take just a minute to talk about the EDA. Most folks in Congress and most folks back in Kansas will have never heard of it. I had not before I entered Congress. It provides these grants and loans to projects it selects all over the country. At its very core, the EDA is nothing more than a giant wealth redistribution machine. It takes money from people in one place and one time and redistributes it all across the country for inherently local projects. For example, $2 million to the Culinary Amphitheater, Wine Tasting Room, and Gift Shop in Washington State. It gave $350,000 to renovate a theater in Colorado. And in 2011, it gave $1.4 million to build infrastructure development so that a steel plant of $1.6 billion could be built in Minnesota. Like the vast majority of projects, that steel plant would have been built without federal taxpayer dollars. It was a $1.6 billion project helped by the federal government to the tune of only $1.4 million. There are even bigger problems, however, with EDA. It's duplicative. It's just one of at least 80 federal economic development agencies. HUD and AG and HHS all have economic development grants as well. Second, it's ineffective. It typically provides a very small part of any given project. The GAO reports that most of its financing did not have any significant effect on the success of projects and produced at best inconclusive results, and in some cases may even detract from a more flexible workforce. Third, this is an incredibly wasteful agency. It was identified as GAO as one of the agencies that ought to go away. Indeed, a recent Inspector General audit of 10 projects totaling $45 million showed that 29% of the grant money had been wasted due to various violations of EDA grant requirements. 4 of the 10 projects EDA funded in that group were never completed. Finally, and perhaps more importantly, this is not the role of the federal government. As the Cato Institute has written, the federal government has no business trying to direct economic activity through politicized subsidy vehicles like EDA. We've seen that with bad outcomes like Solyndra only too recently. Now, every great journey starts with a single step. This is a small agency, but it's time that for the first time in decades, we eliminate an entire program, an entire agency, so that it cannot continue to grow and grow and grow as part of our federal government. I'd ask my colleagues to support the EDA Elimination Act, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lee, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, as one of the founding members of the Congressional Out of Poverty Caucus, I rise today in my ongoing effort to sound the alarm on poverty. As you may know, the census released data showing that 46.2 million Americans lived in poverty in 2010. The data also revealed that the poverty rate for whites was 9.9% in 2010, and worse, the poverty rate for African Americans was 27.4%. For Latinos, the poverty rate was 26.6%, and for Asian Pacific Americans, the poverty rate was 12.1%. And these statistics come on the somber anniversary of the 10 years of the war in Afghanistan, which was a blank check that should not have been written and that, of course, I could not support. And in many ways, this war has significantly contributed to these staggering statistics, which we know are not just numbers, but these are human lives. So we must create jobs, and we have to create a way to maintain our social safety net. So today I'm here to ask my colleagues to join 47 members of Congress and me in a letter to the Joint Select Committee on Deficit Reduction, asking them to protect vital programs that comprise our social safety net, including but not limited to Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security, as well as the programs that provide the economic security and opportunity to millions of Americans. And I ask for unanimous consent to place a copy of this letter into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. None of us envy the work of those members on this Joint Select Committee on Deficit Reduction, as they will have to make tough choices that affect the lives of millions of Americans. However, we should all recognize that for the last 25 years, when we have come to deficit reduction agreements, these agreements have, for the most part, protected low-income programs. We absolutely cannot balance the budget on the backs of the most vulnerable, those people facing or living in poverty. This is really a moral obligation that we cannot ignore. These programs assist the over 46 million Americans living in poverty in 2010, men, women, children, young and old alike, from all backgrounds in obtaining or maintaining their access to basic, mind you, and I'm just talking about basic human needs, including food, shelter, and health care. These vital safety net programs both support and create consumers, which results in increased demand and job creation. This, of course, reduces our deficit by enabling people to participate in this economy. And not only that, many of these programs do provide pathways out of poverty and opportunities for all. More and more Americans are struggling to find work and struggling to make ends meet. And until we create jobs and we have, a pathway where people clearly can be provided these opportunities, we have a real moral obligation to protect these programs. Anything short of this is really un-American. In times like these, it's unconscionable to consider cutting programs that help those most in need, like our nation's seniors and our nation's children. Asking the Joint Select Committee for Deficit Reduction to protect these vital human programs is, though not enough. We have to do more. The most effective anti-poverty program is an effective jobs program. So while I ask my colleagues to join me on the letter to the Joint Select Committee, I'm also here to ask Speaker Boehner to move the American Jobs Act as soon as possible to begin to create jobs and put Americans to work. Americans want to work and they need to work, and yet the House leadership is really focused, as an example, on the dismantling of environmental regulations. This is not a jobs program that puts Americans to work. It's a cynical, opportunistic move in order to attack the environment. And so we have to have as our priority efforts to create jobs that give Americans economic security and that grow our economy. Our economy will not recover quickly from this Great Recession and, of course, a Great Depression in many communities of color, including the African American community, and for those living in poverty, unless we really do provide a pathway out of poverty. We need to target these programs in areas that need it the most, and many of these areas are communities of color, where the poverty rates are 3 times higher than the poverty rate for whites. The unemployment rates are also higher in communities of color. 16.7% of African Americans are unemployed, 11.3% of Latinos. And these are just the reported statistics. It's clear that we must address these disparities as we work to create jobs and opportunities for all. So I'm asking members to join us in this deficit reduction letter and urge the Speaker and leadership of this House to move the American Jobs Act as a first step in jump-starting this economy and putting Americans back to work.
Gentleman's time has expired. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Dold, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just last week I had the opportunity to host a manufacturers roundtable to hear firsthand from job creators in the 10th District of Illinois. These business leaders spoke about the challenges that they are facing and how decisions made right here in Washington, D.C. impact their ability to create jobs and put Illinois back to work. The entrepreneurs I met with expressed their concern with the uncertainty in the marketplace and spoke about the difficulties they face when competing in a global marketplace. From trade to excessive regulations, it is clear that much work needs to be done right here in Washington, D.C. Despite the problems that our country and businesses face, I am optimistic about the future. Just yesterday, the President sent long-anticipated trade agreements to Congress for approval. We heard the President talk about his Jobs Act. And while there may be some disagreement about the Jobs Act, certainly I think that there is areas where we can agree. And I think that we ought to move those aspects forward. Certainly when we talk about the trade agreements, I would argue that's one of the areas that has broad bipartisan support, and we should move it forward for the American public. We have 650 manufacturers in Illinois' 10th Congressional District, representing 80,000 jobs. 50,000 of those jobs rely upon exports. And I would argue that our ability to open and expand markets will create that demand. 73% of the world's purchasing power is outside of the United States. 95% of the consumers are outside of the United States borders. We want to make sure that we have an agreement, an arrangement, where we can knock down these barriers, where we can allow the American worker to compete on a level playing field. If we're able to do that, the American worker will win. We know that for every $1 billion that we increase in trade, we create 6,250 jobs right here at home. We know that it would add, just with South Korea alone, would add $10 billion to our GDP. This is a step certainly in the right direction. In Illinois, manufacturing accounts for 93% of our exports, and these exports support 25% of the manufacturing jobs in our state, a state that's lost 750,000 manufacturing jobs over the last decade. Small businesses are also a big part of those exports. By ratifying the pending trade agreements, we are empowering manufacturers, small business owners, and entrepreneurs. This is exactly the type of bipartisan action we need to be taking in these tough economic times. While there is much more work that needs to be done, we should be encouraged by the movement on the trade agreements and use this as a stepping stone to continue working together and finding common ground. When we come together for the American public, we can create an economic certainty that allows small business owners all across the land to be able to forecast, have some more certainty, invest in their business, and create jobs. There are 29 million small businesses in our nation. If we can create an environment here in Washington, D.C., where half of those businesses can create one job, think about where we'd be then. I ask my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to come together to pass these pending trade agreements. Put the American worker first, and let's get America back to work. I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Rangel, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
This morning, I was pleased to see that the Council of Catholic Bishops have organized in order to influence Washington as it relates to the question of same-sex marriage and abortion. I think that we all agree that these are moral issues, and under our country's freedom of speech, the churches, the synagogues, the temples have a right, and indeed, in their case, an obligation to speak out of the actions of Congress that they disapprove of morally. I hope that this is a signal to other religious institutions that what this country is going through is not only a financial crisis, but a moral crisis, and that perhaps the other religions might broaden their agenda to talk about what I truly believe is a priority and concern of every religion, and that is a deep-seated moral obligation to take care of the vulnerable in our society, whether it's the lesser of our brothers and sisters, whether it's the sick and the aged. It's something about Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, about having a home and a job that to me has something that involves a moral obligation. When a great country like the United States, the beacon for people that come from all over the world in order to be successful, finds itself with so much of our national wealth being concentrated in the hands of so few people, never before has this happened in history, where we find more and more children and adults going into poverty in historic numbers, where we find the shrinking of our middle class, where all of our dreams and aspirations are planted, born, and conceived in the United States of America, where we have so many brave American men and women fighting causes in foreign countries that their parents don't understand, and they come home with emotional and physical disabilities that we can never thank them for their courage. And when we see young people in Wall Street and the Wall Streets around this country protesting, and they're being ridiculed because they have no leaders, they have no single cause, they never knew each other, they're not organized. But neither is America's pain and concern organized. People are mad as hell. They really think that they've been let down. They worked so hard to achieve what they had achieved in this great country. And the greatest thing about America is not what you achieved, in my opinion, is having the hope that you can make it in America. And so that's why it is so painful to see how this middle class, who was more recently, if you look at history, formed in this country, where people thought that having a car and a home and a job, sending your kids to college for an education, being secure in your retirement, and knowing that one day health care would be available for everybody. Are these just political issues? No, I think they're moral issues, and that's why when I went down to meet with the protesters, I'd hoped that more of our spiritual leaders would be there to give guidance, to give encouragement, to give direction, so that we can say that this is a civilized society and people just can't break the law and scream, but they can demand attention, and that's what they are doing. So it seems to me that we in the Congress are getting involved too politically and ignoring the pain and the suffering that's taking place in this country today. When we can find one of the parties saying that they will not entertain a bill that's being proposed to us in order to put America back to work, when they say that their primary goal is to get rid of Obama, when they say that no jobs bill is going to be accepted except what they pick and choose, when they refuse to bring to the floor of this House something that we can discuss to give hope back to the people, I think that's not just a political question. I think it's a moral question as well. God, yes, God, bless America.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Bouchon, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to honor U.S. Army Private First Class Brett Everett Wood. PFC Wood, a 19-year-old native of Spencer, Indiana, lost his life in combat on September 9th in Kandahar, Afghanistan, during an insurgent attack on his unit with an improvised explosive device. PFC Wood was assigned to the 1st Battalion, 5th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Stryker Brigade Combat Team, 25th Infantry Division, Fort Wainwright, Alaska. Indiana lost a great citizen who enlisted with his brother, Nick, during the summer of 2010. His sacrifice and valor in defense of the freedoms we hold dear should be commended, and I would like to offer my most heartfelt condolences to PFC Wood's family and friends. From a grateful nation, he will be missed, but not forgotten. With that, I yield back. Thank you.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Costa, for 5 minutes.
Ask unanimous consent to advise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise this morning to honor and pay tribute to an outstanding service and dedication of the Honorable Judge Oliver W. Wanger on the occasion of his retirement last week from the United States District Court for the Eastern District of California. For the past 20 years, Judge Wanger has served the people of California admirably and courageously, a commitment to the justice and fairness of the law. Moreover, he is extremely knowledgeable and always attempted to balance the scales of justice when hearing cases in general and specifically to cases dealing with California's water and environmental issues. During his tenure, District Court Judge Wanger has developed a mastery of complex federal and state water and endangered species law, putting forth many substantial rulings entitling lengthy and several hundreds of pages requiring painstaking attention to detail. Some of the most noteworthy in recent years were findings with respect to the operations of the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project that convey water supplies throughout California, including the San Joaquin Valley and Southern California, for urban use, for agricultural use. Were it not for Judge Wanger's attention to the letter of the law, farmers, farm workers, and farm communities in the Valley would have continued to suffer from job losses and uncertainty during the most recent drought period, while federal agencies and this administration clung to flawed science and regulations that were destructive. Judge Wanger has worked tirelessly on these issues, often putting in 75 to 80 hours a week. His retirement now leaves only 2 active judges in the already understaffed district court, which extends from the Oregon border to the Tehachapi Mountains south of Bakersfield. In a letter to Chief Judge Anthony Ishii regarding his coming retirement, Judge Wanger expressed grave concerns over the immense and unbearable workload that his departure will create. And let me read from his letter. The impacts on these judges is best understood by my last 5 years. 161 jury trials to verdict, 5,465 courtroom hours, 3,554 terminal and civil cases, in which the individual caseload approaching 1,200 cases in a 5-year period. Judge Wanger also went on to say, now who will handle these cases? Despite our pleas to and Congress's expressed recognition of the need, the continued refusal to create new desperately needed judgeships for the Eastern District of California has created a hardship on the federal court. It's been more than 31 years since a new district judge position was created in Fresno, a division with over 2.5 million people. The continued erosion of the Eastern District Court's ability to provide public with a timely and effective federal judicial service is a burden on our nation, and the litigants should not suffer. End of quote in his letter. What Judge Wanger pointed out, and is not only a disservice of the men and women who serve the court, but the individuals throughout the region and the businesses whose cases are delayed years in some cases. This surely was not what our founding fathers had in mind for our country when they ensured that all Americans have a right to a speedy trial. And as we know, justice delayed can oftentimes be justice denied. Although the problem is not unique to the Eastern District of California, it is the problem where it is most pronounced, with by far the nation's largest caseload per judge. Legislation has been introduced in the House and the Senate to create additional judgeships in district courts where the need is greatest. Unfortunately, it has not been acted on. It is past time for the Congress to act on these bills to ensure that all branches of government are in fact working for the American people. In closing, I want to publicly thank Judge Oliver Wanger for his service to our nation. And I'd ask unanimous consent to enter Judge Wanger's letter into the record. I yield the balance of my time.
Without objection. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Americans are hurting. And there's nothing more important right now for every member of Congress than fostering job growth for the American people. House Republicans have been focused on this since day one. We've passed more than a dozen pro-jobs bills that are currently awaiting a vote in the Senate. Additionally, we also passed a budget this year, something the Senate hasn't done in 888 days. 888 days, Mr. Speaker. America must lead the world out of this global recession, and I, for one, believe that if we can just get a couple of things right in Washington, we'll see our economy turn around, and therefore the world economy turn around. In the House, we believe in helping small business, we believe in free trade, and we believe in shrinking bureaucracy. Measures supporting these causes have already passed the House, with bipartisan support, I might add, Mr. Speaker, only to stall in a Democratic-controlled Senate. Mr. Speaker, House Democrats and Republicans have found common ground on many measures to build more confidence for job creators. We invite the Senate to join our efforts. Mr. Speaker, Americans can't wait. It's time for the Senate to join the House in taking action to help restore our economy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield the balance of my time.
The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Spear, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise once again to talk about the epidemic of rape in the military. This is the 9th time that I've stood on the floor of this House to speak about the unspeakable. Each of these military members have served proudly for their country. Each of them has been raped. And each has been re-victimized by a system of justice that protects perpetrators and punishes victims. I will continue to share these stories until something changes. Survivors can email me at stopmilitaryrape@mail.house.gov if they would like to speak out. Today I want to tell you about Sergeant Rebecca Havrilla. She served in the Army from 2004 to 2008. Her job was as an explosive ordnance disposal technician. In other words, she was responsible for disposing IEDs before they went off. So she took on one of the toughest jobs in the military. Yet during basic training, she heard her commanders repeatedly equate being female with being weak or incompetent. They used terms to describe women that cannot be repeated on this floor. Commanders required Sergeant Havrilla and her colleagues to attend classes regarding prevention of sexual assault and harassment once a year. Commanders made a mockery of these classes. As the instructor would describe prohibited conduct, one or more of the soldiers would begin engaging in that conduct. One soldier went as far as to strip completely naked and get on the table during a break in the middle of class. His punishment was to serve as the equal opportunity representative and lead the next sexual assault harassment training. Disgusting is too benign a word to describe this conduct. Sergeant Havrilla deployed to Afghanistan in 2006. Her supervisor sexually harassed her. He began to slap her bottom whenever he passed by. He belittled and mocked her. On one occasion, he told her exactly what he wanted to do with her in graphic detail. Nothing was done in response. It was another colleague, one from the K-9 unit, that raped her. He even photographed the rape, and some of the pictures ended up on a pornographic website. Imagine a system of justice in such shambles that an assailant would actually take pictures of the crime and put them on the Internet. Sergeant Havrilla reported her rape under the military's restricted reporting policy. In February of 2009, she reported for 4 weeks of active duty training. While there, she ran into her rapist and went into shock. She immediately sought the assistance of the military chaplain. The chaplain told her that it must have been God's will for her to be raped and recommended that she attend church more frequently. God's will. This is the support system for victims of rape and sexual assault in the military? Sergeant Havrilla now suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder and chronic depression. In describing her decision to speak out, she said this: "Leadership needs to be held accountable, and women need to be able to work without the fear of being assaulted by their own colleagues. This is one of the hardest things I've done, and I want to thank the other women that have stepped forward as well. It's never easy to put yourself out there." Sergeant Havrilla is right. It's time for leadership to be held accountable. Leadership in the Pentagon, leadership at the White House, and leadership here in Congress. I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Thompson, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, request unanimous consent to revise and extend.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise to recognize the many hospital professionals that serve every day to keep our communities leading strong, healthy lives. Having spent 28 years as a therapist, rehabilitation services manager, and a licensed nursing home administrator, I know firsthand the many challenges this industry continues to face. Medicare and medical assistance payments are just a few of the many variables beyond a hospital's control. Medicare that only pays 80 to 90 cents for every dollar of cost in delivering care. Medical assistance that only pays 40 to 60 cents for every dollar of cost in delivering care. As Congress continues to work on issues impacting this industry, it is important to recognize the critical role our hospitals play in not only providing access to cost-effective care, but also economic growth. In my home state of Pennsylvania, more than 584,000 individuals depend on hospitals for their jobs through direct and indirect employment. The economic contributions made by Pennsylvania's hospitals to local communities continues to increase, rising to $98.9 billion in 2010, and that's up from $89.8 billion during 2008. When 268,000 hospital employees spend money on products and services, it translates to nearly 317,000 additional hospital service-related jobs and more than $13 billion in employee compensation. More than $27.2 billion in total labor income is generated directly and indirectly by Pennsylvania hospitals. In 55 of the 67 Pennsylvania counties, hospitals remain among the top 5 employers, providing family-sustaining jobs and solid benefits. Every additional dollar in employee compensation in the hospital sector results in 92 cents of wages to other Pennsylvania industries. At a time marked by so much uncertainty, lawmakers need to ensure that hospitals remain viable assets in our communities, where they can provide jobs, support other businesses, and continuing offering these critical services. Hospitals are about access to quality care and jobs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back the balance of my time.
Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess until noon today.
And the House returns at noon Eastern to begin legislative work. Members will consider another temporary federal spending